I want people to understand that what's occurred in this country is our government has handed out licenses to steal to large institutions who have then used those licenses to steal not just from the federal government, but from all of you and I as taxpayers. I'm talking primarily about the banks, and I want to be real specific about what that license is. The facts that I'm talking about here are detailed with great specificity in the consent judgments that were signed by the big banks and institutions that were part of the 49 state attorney general settlement. Now, unfortunately, after the reporting about the record settlements that the 49 state attorney generals reached on our behalf, no one has followed up on those settlements. No one really has dug deeply into those settlements to understand exactly what it is. But I'm going to be real clear and I'm going to be real succinct about this. But everyone needs to read those consent judgments. The situation here is that when the banks and institutions go out and loan money and make these loans, they are what's called a government-sponsored enterprise or direct endorsement lenders that are not lending out their own money. They're lending out the money of the federal treasury. That's yours and my taxpayer dollars. And when these loans are made by Bank of America, by Wells, by Citi, by Chase, they're supposed to be made according to very strict, explicit requirements. And the fact of the matter is that the crisis that occurred in this country was due in large part because the banks and institutions just completely ignored all of those underwriting requirements. And yes, they wrote loans and gave loans to borrowers that should not have had them, and they would not have written those loans if the banks had followed the explicit requirements of being a direct endorsement lender. Because exactly what was happening is when they wrote those loans, Bank of America was given the checkbook of the United States of America, and they were writing those loans with the checkbook that is the taxpayer money. Now, they ignored those underwriting requirements, and yet we're still closing loans. Why? Because when they closed that loan for $100,000, Bank of America shoved money into their pocket. And then as part of the contract, after Bank of America wrote that loan, they collected the payments each month. And each month as they collected those payments from the borrower, the homeowner, they siphoned off a little more money because they were servicing it. They were collecting money. Well, when the loan went into default, Bank of America was able to collect more money. And I'm just singling out Bank of America, but the situation as detailed in the Office of Inspector General audit reports is it's not just Bank of America, it's all the banks. But as they were servicing these loans, they were collecting money. And again, when it went into foreclosure and went into bankruptcy, they were collecting even more money. Now, we all heard about the settlements being about robo-signing, but the fact of the matter is the robo-signing was just a distraction. Fabricating the documents, the assignments, the allonges, the endorsements, all of those things were just a means to the end. They were fabricating the documents they needed to submit in courtrooms all across this country, state courts and federal court, so that they could get to what is the ultimate goal, and that is to foreclose on a home and take it back so that they could then make yet another claim on the federal government. Because again, remember, these loans are federally insured. As a direct endorsement lender, you're using the checkbook of the United States of America. When you make that loan, the contract is that when it goes bad, the United States of America, that's you and I as taxpayers, are going to step in and we're going to make you whole. We're going to pay you, Bank of America or Wells or Citi or Chase, again, on top of all the money you already made wrongfully. And again, this is where it gets so ugly and so insulting and freaking infuriating as the American taxpayer, because they engaged in improper behavior in fabricating the documents that were submitted in federal court and submitted in state court in order to take back title to that home. And again, once they take back title to the home, they get paid again. These allegations and the specific agreements that the banks signed, that they in fact engaged in all this improper behavior, and specifically that they were filing false claims, are again detailed in the consent judgments that are part of the National Mortgage Settlement. I continue to rail about how these settlements were a complete sellout and probably even treasonous behavior on the part of our government, who caught them doing this, who caught them pocketing billions of dollars, and then come up with this ridiculous settlement that's just a few $billion. But the fact of the matter is, those billions of dollars that the bank shoved into their pockets, and now they're handing us back a few pennies that they made as a result of that. That's why it's so insulting. And here in the state of Florida, one of the things that just blows my mind, it makes it completely off the charts insulting, is the fact that the settlements that the bank signed were supposed to be used to help consumers, quote unquote, help consumers. It's explicit. It's in the settlement. It's in all the press conferences. But what I find so insulting about what's happening here in the state of Florida is the money that the banks are paying, which are nothing more than bribes. The banks have bribed the government to let them off. Here in the state of Florida is being used to fund court systems, the rocket dockets once again, which are speeding along and throwing Americans out of the home quicker. So they've actually rewarded the banks. Here in the state of Florida, the banks that were caught doing grossly improper things, defrauding the federal government, making false insurance claims, pay a quote-unquote penalty. That penalty is being used to benefit the banks, to support the banks, setting up rocket dockets, which is what is occurring in this state, using the money that the banks stole from the taxpayers, from the federal government, is not helping consumers. And yet that's what's happening in the state of Florida. And then, even this week, the Florida legislature is considering a bill that once again rewards the banks and institutions for their fraudulent, their potentially criminal, and certainly reckless behavior. House Bill 87, with the express stated purpose of speeding foreclosures and making them more quote-unquote efficient, is nothing more than another bailout to the banks. And again, as a result of the settlements that were reached where they sign and admit this conduct, the state of Florida, the legislators that are elected, that should be representing us, should not be using that settlement as a means to say, well, it's over. They've admitted their wrongdoing, and now we can just get on with things. No. The fact that they have admitted their wrongdoing, and in fact it is incorporated into these judgments, should serve as a roadmap to our state legislators to look at that and say, now, wait a minute. Bank of America, Wells, Citi, all these banks that have signed these consent decrees. We as state legislators should be looking at that and saying to ourselves, we are going to protect the citizens of the state of Florida. And looking at the conduct and the wrongdoing that you engaged in and you have now admitted to, we're going to make increased standards at the state level. We're going to give our judges increased power to sanction the wrongdoing of the banks and institutions who are national institutions but who come into this state and do such damage and victimize the consumers of the state of Florida. But unfortunately, we know that's not what's going to happen. It's not what's going to happen because the United States of America is a fascist empire. Fascist in the sense that we have this fusion together of the government and corporate interest, the government doing the bidding of the banks and institutions, not as for you and I as American taxpayers. It's evident so clearly in Lanny Brewer, a Department of Justice official who resigned after that PBS documentary special Untouchables. This official who should be standing up for the rule of law, but admits quite directly and explicitly that he felt that it was his job to protect these institutions who stole, not just from you and I as taxpayers, and not just from the federal government, but in international schemes to steal and defraud, and specifically in the case of HSBC, laundering money for drug lords, billions of dollars, laundering money for Iran and terrorist regimes. Explicitly proven that this was occurring, and yet the Department of Justice and the federal government saying we won't do anything to them. And trust me, when they file a little bit of penalties, that's not doing anything to them. And then we just continue on and see what this government is doing. We're coddling the banks and institutions. Timothy Geithner, Federal Reserve, again, he's in charge of the purse of the federal government. The taxpayers, our money. Timothy Geithner is in charge of that. And rather than doing his job to regulate and sanction these the conduct of these banks and institutions when they do wrong, he decided that it was his job to quote-unquote foam the runways for the banks and institutions. You know, it seems like there's only two guys that are left in this country that care about the American people, frankly care about integrity and the rule of law. A guy by the name of Neil Barofsky. He was a United States attorney. He was the guy that was charged first with the Bush administration and then coming in with the Obama administration with monitoring the public purse. And this guy, of course, was shown the door and thrown out and attacked and persecuted because he was doing his job. He's one guy left out there who has some legitimacy among American people because he was actually doing his job for us. And Matt Taibbi, you know, a reporter left standing who was actually out there doing hard-hitting reporting, who's telling the truth anymore. If you look at the mainstream media, they're not talking about things that Matt Taibbi and Neil Barofsky are talking about. They're not pointing you to the consent judgments that actually detail the wrongdoing and the criminality that occurs. They're not talking about the things that are occurring in this state of Florida, which is in many metrics the most corrupt state in the entire nation because of the regimes that are in power right there that are doing nothing but supporting the corporations and not doing anything at all to support, protect, and defend the citizens and the consumers of the state of Florida. But one of the things that over all of this is most disappointing to me is how consumers are not standing up anymore. You know, legislators are meeting up in Tallahassee and the lobbyists are telling them what to do, but there's not nearly enough consumers up there that are writing in, they're screaming and protesting, and there's certainly not enough at the federal level of people doing that. So things are going to get much worse here in the state of Florida because of the money that the banks have paid to the court systems to quote-unquote help consumers. Foreclosures are moving much more quickly. And so consumers are going to be thrown out into the street. And all of the conduct that they did that was wrong, and we know that is wrong, and it's documented that is wrong, they're going to get away with that because we now have court systems which are charged, they believe, with granting foreclosure judgments and throwing people out of the street even more quickly. Terrible times out there, people, and it's only going to get worse.